one of the things, one of probably the most infamous ones is the Chicago principles that people
Right.
kind of talk about. And in the past, and in your book, you're critical about institutions that have adopted the Chicago principles, and you talk about this one size fits all statement that offers false assurances. And instead, you say you have to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of the principles for starting a conversation about public speech, rather than an end in itself. So I'm wondering whether you can expand about your critical elements of the Chicago principles, and then also whether there's examples of institutions that have successfully adapted to the principles, to the individual circumstances and the community norms.
So the Chicago Principles. So the Chicago Principles, for those who don't know, there is a relatively short statement, a couple pages that the University of Chicago has developed, where basically they are expressing a commitment to the core principles of freedom of expression and rejecting a demand for adapting protections for freedom of expression for the context of the university. So basically they're saying whatever is allowed legally is allowed here. And I think this is misguided for two reasons. The one is the reason that you mentioned, Diane, which is that different institutions have different needs in this regard. And those relate to their own histories, they relate to the population that they serve, they relate to changes in needs and expectations over time, including the current generational change that really has students listening more to forms of exclusion and harm and demanding that we address them, which I think is a good contribution to the discussion. Maybe it's not always conclusive, right? Whatever a student says should be immediately adhered to, but I think they are a good contribution, which the Chicago principles reject without conversation. So generational difference, institutional difference, population difference, historical difference, all of these matter, and we have to note them in our policies and our practices. So that's one reason, right? And the other reason really is that I think learning institutions, including both schools and higher education institutions, are they need and require some level of autonomy in order to operate. And this autonomy also has to allow for them to adjust their policies and practices according to their mission, right? And so we have the public square over there. It's really just the laws, the charter here, the constitution, right? Or whatever is the legal framework, and the court precedents, the way that they interpret it and what they require. That's the public square. At the university, I'm allowed to say, look, you might be able to say this on social media or at home. That's not how we talk here, right? So the Flat Earth Society, as it turns out, it has room in the US. It's a club. People participate in that, and they make a strong claim that the earth is flat, and that's what they believe. They have conferences and meetings. Do we need a flat earth department, near the, I don't know, the geography or astronomy departments? I don't think so, because that's not how we think in a learning community. It's protected speech. We don't need that, right? So we have our own boundaries that are based both on our epistemic practices, right? The kind of knowledge and evidentiary practices that we have. And we also have our own practices in regards to the kind of welcoming environment that we want to create to our students and our staff and our faculty. And that's a responsibility that we have. When we admit a student to come and learn here, what we are telling them is this: you belong. We want you here. We admitted you. You are a member of our community. So we have to live up to it. And sometimes that means that our boundaries are going to be different. And I think that should be acceptable. And I think the Chicago principle doesn't make room for any of that. It's completely fine for the University of Chicago because that's the kind of thing that they want to do, and that's fine. But, you know, the University of Calgary can decide that it wants to do something different.
So the first question that I'll ask is from somebody in our online Zoom room. Does inability to discuss ideas and fear surrounding sharing perspectives disproportionately represent certain viewpoints in a democracy? If so, or if not, how do we safeguard our democracy from this sort of behavior?
Great. So definitely the burden of having your speech silenced is not equally distributed, right? And obviously, when your experiences or your perspectives are marginal in various ways, it means that your voice is going to be normally lower, right? And it means that people oftentimes would have an interest in not listening to you, right? It's challenging, you're bringing in something different, you're maybe raising a concern or a disagreement. And we all were just having such a nice time together. We were all agreeing with each other. What do we need your voice for, right? And this, in the political domain, a lot of people have raised the concern that at least in some college contexts, this is applied that is more typical of conservative students. And more broadly, I think it is typical in a different way of students who belong to various minority identities as well, right? Religious identities, indigenous folks in areas where there aren't many indigenous people who are studying with them at their school, racial minorities, et cetera, right? So people who have specific identities oftentimes either are called on to represent everyone who shares their identity, which in itself is a way of silencing their individual voice, or sometimes they are rejected from the public conversation or silenced in subtle and social ways. And I think this is a real concern because we come in with our identity and that this is who we are, but we want to be also seen as individuals with our opinions and perspectives, etc. In the ideological domain, it's slightly different, right? Because we come in with our ideology, but the ideology is a topic of exchange, right? It's a topic where you can update your views in a way that's quite distinct from the ways in which you might update your identity. I mean, people do that, you know, they can, I don't know, convert to a different religion or something. So you can switch your identity, but it's not the same as changing your views, right? It's a different dimension. And so I think, yes, people, you know, who are part of a majority, either politically, ideologically, or in terms of their various identities, may find it easier to share their opinions, and other people would find that the burden of chilled speech, of silencing norms and practices, and also silencing regulatory interventions from legislatures, all of these are impacting some people more than others. And really the responsibility of a learning institutions like this one is to lift some of the burden from the shoulders of the people who are carrying it more, right? So it's an institutional commitment to open expression that has to ensure that everyone not only nominally can speak and not be censored, but they can actually get up and talk, right? And this is necessary for us to function properly as a learning institution because we need everyone's voices. That's why they are here, right? And, you know, and there are various practices that we can take as institutions in order to ensure that.
I love that. The institutional commitment piece is so important. Do we have any questions from the crowd here? We've got one at the front.
Thank you. What limits should there be to free speech?
Well, you know, the limits, okay. So if you're asking, I assume that you are asking in the context of a higher education institution or more broadly within the context of an institution, right? So because, the other answer is pretty easy, like ask your lawyer, right? I mean, uh, there are legal boundaries. Obviously, you cannot harass people, you cannot defame people. I mean, so there are boundaries that the law and the courts have delineated for us, and those are what they are, and they are true within our institution the same way that they are true in any business or workplace, right? Within learning institutions, I think, as I said in the answer about the Chicago statement, these are more diverse, right? And they have to do with both the particular mission of the institution and with some of the contingent factors within the institution, such as who is it that they serve, what histories they represent. Berkeley has a different vision that Stanford has, and I think that's fine. They have a different history, right? Some colleges that are serving particular populations, for example, women's colleges, historically Black colleges and universities in the U.S., Hispanic serving institutions. They have a different population that they serve, and they might decide that over here, these are the kind of things that we do, and these are the kind of things that we don't do. And I think they should have the autonomy to do that. To just give you like the general sort of like norms that I think we should reflect on when we are setting our institutional boundaries, I think we need to think about our epistemic commitments, right? So what kind of knowledge are we committed to? And what are the disciplinary and scientific and evidentiary practices that we can rely on in order to advance this knowledge, right? So this is my example of the Flat Earth Society, right? There might be forms of knowledge that we're not interested in, or that are misguided or simply wrong, and so we're not going to promote them. So one is the epistemic efforts that we're making. And the second one is really the forms of inclusion that we are trying to create within our institution. So my sense is that we can have practices and norms around how do we have a conversation where all voices can be heard. So we can decide that there are perspectives or forms of expression that while, if somebody raises them in the room, we're going to hear them, but we are not going to promote them as institutions, right? So, if you are a member of the community and you have a certain perspective that the institution doesn't support, you can share your perspective, right? The effort is not to censor you, but there might be ways of reflecting as an institution our value commitments, right? And our perspectives that might not support your views if they are exclusionary, if we think that a certain view is going to silence some members of our community, if we think that these views might be inappropriate for a certain context of learning and the like. So I think we can have norms of conversation that are institutionally based and are meant to advance our perspective in this regard. So it's a little general, but as I said, I don't think it's one size fits all.
For our next question, which is, could you discuss some of the specific books that are being banned in schools? What are some of the themes or issues they address that are resulting in these bans?
Great. So thank you for this question. This is really a great a topic of great concern. So for me, and for a lot of people in the US. So the most typically the topics that are being banned, erased, or rejected from school libraries have to do with 2 or 3 general themes. The one theme is the topic of a racial diversity. So books that represent people with minority racial and ethnic identities. For example, one of the books that is typically being banned right now is a book about Rosa Parks. So it's a children's picture book about Rosa Parks. Another one that was recently banned in a number of districts is about Roberto Clemente. So basically people whose identities are of being members of racial or ethnic minority groups, whether they were fighting for racial justice like Rosa Parks, or whether it's a story about their personal experiences in life, being, you know, an athlete or otherwise known person, or even just, you know, a fictional character that is a minority, as well as immigrants. So this is, you know, books about immigrants are also often banned right now. And the other main group is books that have to do with gender diversity and sexual identity, particularly about queer or gay folks. And this has to do with anything from, if you know the book about the penguins and Tango Makes Three, this one is banned across the US in a variety of districts right now because it has two fathers, penguins who have a chick, you know, an egg and then a baby penguin, as well as books like Genderqueer, or books that have to do with kids who are transgender or gender fluid. So the way that the process works is that some states, Florida, Idaho, Tennessee, there are a few others, are passing laws that basically say that books that are inappropriate or age inappropriate should not be in the school libraries, but the language is very vague. And they set up processes for banning the books, and they set up penalties locally. And some of these penalties call for firing librarians and teachers who have these books on their shelves, or fining them significant fines, right? And so a lot of districts and a lot of teachers, understandably, are saying, you know what, am I gonna lose my job over the book about the penguins? I'm gonna read a different book, you know? There's actually a book about ducks. And in the ducks, I'm serious, there is a Mr. Duck and Mrs. Duck. Other than that, it's pretty much the same book. I mean, they're both happening in New York. I mean, you know, it's the same kind of book. So you know, so I'm not touching that. And I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not blaming the librarians or the teachers. You know, do you lose your job over any one of these? It's very, you need the income. And the process for banning the books is, in many districts, is that one parent's concern takes the book off the shelves for review. And the process of review is unclear in itself, right? And so how do you decide now that it's an appropriate book? In one district, we had recently one parent complaint that got 700 books off the shelf in the school library. So basically, you know, it's no wonder that the teachers are covering their classroom libraries and are just, you know what, never mind, you know, we'll read, I don't know what, the coffee machine manual, something that is definitely not, well, it's not age appropriate, but it's definitely not going to get me into trouble, right? For me, the effort here is the effort to delineate who belongs, right? As I said before, who is a real American for the purpose of these laws? People who are immigrants, who are queer, who are trans, who are racial and ethnic minorities, are marked by these bans as not belonging, right? So even if they are in the room as students or as teachers, they need to be silenced about their identities, right? If there's a kid in the room who has two dads, can they say something about it? Or now that they see that the book is banned, maybe they know that they have to be quiet about their own family. Or if the teacher, you know, is a male and has a husband, right? Shouldn't talk about that. We'll take the pride flag off the wall. Those are also banned. So, right, the difficulty here that is an effort to create a cultural change that is, by my understanding, exclusionary of common identities in our society, increasingly common and increasingly visible. And this is a reason to fight against book bans in support of freedom of expression and inclusion. You see that it does both in one swoop, right?
Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation. We've spent a lot of the last 3 years telling people to stay away from each other for
Right.
public health reasons. To what extent has that exacerbated the problem, and how do we fix it?
Right. This is a wonderful and difficult question. And we are definitely seeing that the awkward way in which we are returning into in-person contact is rife with difficulty. It's rife with difficulty because we are out of habit, right? We just don't know how to make small talk anymore, if we ever did. We don't know how to connect on the interpersonal level, particularly in the casual settings or in settings where people are not fully familiar to us. Younger folks have been trained to be afraid of contact, right? And the younger you are, the bigger part of your life it is, right? Stay away. You are yourself a risk to me, right? And it's setting us up for, as you said, exacerbating these concerns regarding the social foundations of democratic practice that we really depend on for shared governance. And of course, you know, there's the whole other big issue that goes with that, particularly with young folks, but also others regarding mental health, right? Really, the pandemic and the extended isolation has exacerbated matters of mental health, which, you know, it's a whole separate issue, which of course is beyond my expertise, but it's also affecting our tolerance for conflict, our ability to engage beyond context that cause anxiety and stress, right? And so all of these for sure are affecting the discussion about protecting open expression and the actual flow of ideas so that we can have the context of free inquiry that we need in higher education institutions, as well as the broader democratic connection. How to address that? Well, so it's not easy, and it's not like this, you know, it's really through trying to rethread these kinds of civic fabrics that have been torn by the pandemic and continue to be torn by the current condition of affective polarization. I really think that even small exchanges at the interpersonal level can help us overcome some of these challenges. One of my favorite cartoons of recent time has been a neighbor coming over to her next door neighbor and saying, "Can I borrow a cup of sugar? I know that I could go to Instacart or to, you know, the next supermarket, but I'm trying to stave off loneliness, rebuild democracy, and make muffins." You know, so these are small, neighborly, interpersonal, you know, face-to-face interactions that I think can help us rebuild some of what was lost.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we're going to take one last question from our online audience, and then we'll move it over to Diane to close things down for the night. It takes an incredible amount of courage to take on the hegemonic ideas in universities and colleges. How do we approach those who have so much power?
Right. So it's a great and important question, and I actually want to flip it, right? So I think definitely a person who has a marginal or dissenting, marginal numerically, right, or dissenting opinion needs a lot of courage in order to get up and say, well, you never talk about this. You haven't heard my voice, right? And you need a lot of strength to be able to do that. But I actually want to argue that the main demand that we should have is that the institutions create the conditions where we don't need this much courage in order to do that, so that we don't need to be this one special person who can really get up, even as they are the only ... in the room, right? The only person who thinks like them or who has their experience or identity in the room, getting up and doing it. It's so hard. And so it's on the institution to create the conditions that make it at least a little less hard. And I'll give you one example in a classroom. So I think classrooms oftentimes fall into it's not every classroom, obviously, but oftentimes we fall into we are lulled into a sense of a shared view, right? The professor might say things like, oh, of course, as we all know, blah, blah, blah. Or of course, you would all understand this and that. And maybe somebody's sitting in the room and they're like, well, I'm not, right? But how do you get up and say that, right? And so one practice that I took from a manual at the University of Alaska and I offer in the book is a practice that is called, in some instances, 3 minutes or 5 minutes. So it's the 3 minutes rule. And the 3 minute rule basically is a norm that you set up in your classroom where you say, as an instructor, where you say every person at any point is invited to raise their hand and call for 3 minutes. And this call is to suggest a perspective or opinion that has not been voiced in the conversation so far about our topic, right? And so it's not necessarily something that you believe in or something that represents who you are, but you just heard about this thing and you want that we have a conversation about it for 3 minutes, right? Anyone can give up 3 minutes of their lecture time, right? Let's talk about this for 3 minutes and then we can move on. And so I think this is an example where you invite this dissenting opinion, where you call for it. And you also suggest ahead of time that you are going to respect it, right? Even as it goes probably against the set of perspectives that you were looking to represent in your lecture or in your syllabus, right? And so I think, oh, there we are. Go for it. Do it.
Thank you for the 3 minutes. So I'm two-spirited, LGBTQ2S. I'm First Nations. I'm the first business student here at University of Calgary in our entire history who's doing their PhD in business. And I'm leading a fairly successful culture or a career in the hydrocarbon space. And I'm arriving here at school thinking it'd be a much better space. Thank you for your comment. But I'm finding it's just more of the same.
Mm.
What's our obsession with monoculture? Because I'm hearing the polarization and it's this drive to be a certain way. Even here within the academic space, there's a certain way now I have to be in order to be an academic. I have to do this, then that, then this, and it's all judged.
Mm.
So it's monoculture, like we're obsessed about it. You even look within assimilation, right?
Right.
The assimilation of the indigenous culture into this Turtle Island. It's going away. And now we're feeling this press and fight of our individual cultures as a collective, as Canadians, as Americans, as whatever,
Mm-hmm.
to push to singular spaces.
Thank you for this difficult and important comment. I really want to appreciate you for raising this and especially for noting how the drive for similarity is not actually making us the same. It's just silencing some of us who are not the same, right? On whichever dimension. And so recognizing that diversity is not just a call for, it's not just an aspirational call. It's actually a description of our reality, right? And that if we avoid the calls for diversity on these various dimensions, what we are left with is not a monoculture, it's a culture of silence, right? And so again, I want to appreciate you for your comment, and which I think is very instructive for people who are so inclined to listen and to hear that maintaining an open microphone and an open ear for diverse views, opinions, perspectives, and identities is really something that is material for those who otherwise would not speak, but everyone else is learning from it as well.
I think they turned off the microphone on me on purpose. What a fantastic audience. And I just want to say thank you, Sigal, for your authenticity, your robust analysis. I think for many of us, the trying to delve into free speech is one that is, we step in with trepidation, but you made it manageable. You gave us some thoughts and principles of how we might manage it on a daily basis and at an institutional level. And the generosity of spirit and wisdom. I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the Workman School of Education and the University of Calgary. Thank you. Thank you, guests, for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. It is so wonderful to see you, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you, and have a safe drive home.